Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Pale Watcher. I'm here with you tonight, in those quiet hours when the boundary between our world and something else feels just a little thinner, a little more permeable. I know many of you use these stories to drift off to sleep, to fill the silence with something other than your own thoughts. So before we begin our journey into the dark together, if you're finding value in what we do here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. It helps us reach others who, like you, crave these dark tales in the deepest hours of night. Now, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? What time is it in your part of the world? Are you in bed, lights off, screen glowing in the darkness? Or perhaps you're working a late shift, looking for company in the empty hours? For me, it's always the darkest hour, that liminal space between midnight and dawn when anything seems possible, when the walls between worlds grow thin. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows, pull your blankets a little tighter around you. Let the outside world fade away. And let me tell you about Marcus Webb, a man who thought he understood isolation, who believed he knew what loneliness meant. Let me tell you about the 3 weeks that taught him the difference between solitude and true, absolute aloneness. Or rather, what he thought was aloneness. Because sometimes, you see, the most terrifying thing isn't being alone. It's discovering you never were. My name is Marcus Webb, and I used to think isolation was a gift. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. Wrong about what I needed, wrong about what I was running from, and catastrophically wrong about what might be waiting in the spaces we call empty. The job posting had appeared on my screen like an answer to a prayer I hadn't quite articulated yet. Lighthouse keeper wanted for Beacon Point Light Station, a decommissioned facility perched on a rocky outcrop 12 miles off the coast of Maine. 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Minimal duties, just maintain the automated systems, log weather patterns, and keep the place from falling into complete disrepair. The pay was decent, nothing spectacular, but it came with something I needed far more than money: absolute solitude. No coworkers looking at me with that mixture of pity and discomfort. No well-meaning friends suggesting I get back out there. No phone calls from my mother, her voice tight with worry she tried to hide, asking if I was eating properly, sleeping enough, taking my medication. No reminders, everywhere I looked, of the life I'd built and then watched crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. 6 months earlier, I'd been someone. Marcus Webb, entrepreneur, founder and CEO of Webb Digital Solutions, husband to Jennifer, who'd believed in me when no one else did. Owner of a house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage and a yard where we talked about letting kids play someday. I'd been someone with a future, with trajectory, with purpose. Then the company collapsed. Not slowly, not with warning signs I could have heeded. Just a sudden, catastrophic implosion of bad investments, worse decisions, and market forces beyond my control. Within 3 months, everything was gone. The business, the house, the savings, the retirement accounts. Jennifer had tried to stay, had fought for us even as I retreated into myself, building walls she couldn't scale. Eventually, she'd stopped trying. I couldn't blame her. I'd stopped trying too. Now I was 42 years old, living in my childhood bedroom at my mother's house, and spending most of my days staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out who Marcus Webb was supposed to be now that everything that defined him had been stripped away. The lighthouse job felt like the universe offering me a do-over, a chance to step out of my life completely, to exist in a space where Marcus Webb's failures couldn't follow, where the wreckage of my past couldn't wash up on shore. 3 weeks of nothing but ocean, wind, and my own thoughts. Time to heal, time to think, time to reconstruct myself from whatever pieces remained. I should have known that running from yourself never works. You always take yourself with you. And sometimes, you arrive to find that something's been waiting for you all along. The Coast Guard vessel that carried me out to Beacon Point was piloted by Captain Morrison, a weathered man who looked to be in his late 60s, with skin like tanned leather and eyes the pale gray of storm clouds. He'd been quiet during most of the journey, responding to my attempts at small talk with grunts and single-word answers. As the lighthouse came into view, rising from the churning Atlantic like a pale finger pointing accusingly at an indifferent sky, he finally spoke. "You sure about this?" Morrison asked, cutting the engine and letting us drift toward the dock. The lighthouse loomed above us, its white paint peeling away in long strips, revealing darker stone beneath. 3 weeks is a long time to be alone out here. Long time with nothing but your thoughts and the ocean. That's exactly what I need. I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. The island looked smaller than I'd expected from the photographs in the job posting. Maybe 200 yards across at its widest point, nothing but rock, scrubby grass that had somehow found purchase in stone and the lighthouse itself. No trees, no soil deep enough for anything substantial to grow. Just rock and structure and endless water surrounding it all. Morrison grunted again, his expression impossible to read as he secured the boat to the dock. The wooden planks beneath our feet were weathered and gray, some of them splintered, a few sagging in ways that made me wonder about their structural integrity. "Weather's supposed to turn nasty in a few days," he said, beginning to unload the boxes of supplies. Food, water, batteries, everything I'd need for 3 weeks. Radio's in the keeper's house if you need anything, but reception can be spotty during storms. Sometimes it goes out completely. "I'm sure I'll be fine," I said, grabbing one of the heavier boxes. The weight felt good, grounding. Physical labor, simple and straightforward. No complicated decisions, no ways to fail. Morrison paused in his work, one of the supply boxes balanced on his shoulder. His gray eyes studied me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Previous keeper lasted 4 days," he said flatly. I set down my box carefully. "What happened to him?" "Said he couldn't sleep. Said something about the isolation getting to him." Morrison's gaze didn't waver. "Said he kept hearing things that shouldn't be there. Sounds in the silence. Kept insisting something was wrong with the quiet." I forced myself to laugh, though it came out more nervous than I intended. "I'm looking forward to the quiet. That's the whole point." Morrison's expression didn't change. "Quiet and silence aren't the same thing, son. Out here, you'll learn the difference." He turned back to unloading, his movements methodical and practiced. "Quiet is peaceful. Silence is." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, you'll see." We finished unloading in silence. Or was it quiet? I was already overthinking Morrison's cryptic warning, assigning meaning to the distinction he'd made. The wind had picked up, carrying the salt spray from waves crashing against the rocks that formed the foundation of this tiny island. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and somehow lonely despite being made by dozens of birds at once. "Supply boat comes every 3 weeks like clockwork," Morrison said as he prepared to cast off. "Unless the weather's too bad, but that's rare this time of year. If you need to leave earlier, if something comes up, emergency, change of heart, anything, use the radio. I'll come get you. No judgment, no questions asked." "I won't need to leave early," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubt. Morrison nodded slowly, untying the mooring lines. "Most people say that. Most people are wrong." He paused, one foot on the boat, one still on the dock. "One more thing. If you hear something at night, something that doesn't make sense, don't go looking for it. Don't try to understand it. Just let it be." Curiosity's gotten more than one keeper into trouble out here. Before I could ask what he meant, Morrison had started the engine, the sound impossibly loud after the relative quiet of our conversation. I watched his boat pull away, growing smaller against the vast expanse of gray-blue water, until it was just a white speck disappearing toward the mainland. Then it was gone, and I was alone. Truly, completely alone for the first time in my adult life. The silence Morrison had warned me about hadn't arrived yet. The wind still blew, whistling through gaps in the lighthouse's stone. Waves still crashed rhythmically against the rocks. Gulls still called overhead. But standing there on that dock, watching the empty horizon, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly, more like the first stirring of understanding that I'd committed to something I didn't fully comprehend. I turned to face my new home. The keeper's house was attached to the base of the lighthouse, a 2-story stone structure that looked like it had been built to withstand anything the Atlantic could throw at it. Small windows, thick walls, a solid wooden door that hung slightly crooked in its frame. Above it, the lighthouse tower itself rose another 60 feet, ending in the beacon room where the automated light system rotated day and night, warning ships away from the rocks that had claimed so many vessels over the centuries. The door wasn't locked. Why would it be? I was 12 miles from the nearest human being, surrounded by ocean that was too cold and too rough for casual swimmers. I pushed it open, wincing at the groan of hinges that clearly hadn't been oiled in years. The sound echoed through the empty space beyond, announcing my arrival to absolutely no one. Inside, the keeper's house was spare but functional. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a wood-burning stove in one corner, a small kitchen counter and sink along one wall, and a battered couch and armchair arranged around a coffee table stained with rings from countless cups of coffee or tea. A wooden desk sat beneath one of the windows, and on it rested the log book, a thick, leather-bound volume that looked old enough to be an antique. A narrow staircase led up to the second floor, which I discovered held a single bedroom with a metal-framed bed, a small dresser, and not much else. The bathroom was downstairs, tucked under the stairs, barely large enough to turn around in. And of course, there was the spiral staircase that led up into the lighthouse tower itself, beginning just off the main room and disappearing into shadow above. I spent that first afternoon unpacking my supplies and exploring. The automated beacon system was remarkably simple, a rotating light powered by solar panels and batteries, with backup generators in case of extended cloudy periods. My job was essentially to make sure nothing broke, to log weather conditions twice daily, and to radio in once a week to confirm everything was operational. The rest of my time was my own. Perfect. Exactly what I needed. Time to think, to read, to figure out who I was supposed to be now. Time to heal in solitude. Except, as I flipped through the logbook that first evening, eating a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the wood stove, I started noticing something odd in the previous entries. They went back years, filled with routine observations from dozens of different keepers. Weather patterns, maintenance notes, the occasional comment about wildlife or passing ships. Mundane stuff, exactly what you'd expect. But as I got closer to the present, the entries changed. Not all of them. Some keepers seemed to have had perfectly normal stays. But every few months, there would be entries that were different. The handwriting would start neat and controlled, then become increasingly erratic. Observations about weather would give way to notes about sounds, about feelings, about the quality of silence on the island. One keeper, about 18 months ago, had written, "The silence here has texture. During the day, it's one thing, just the absence of human noise, peaceful and clarifying. But at night, it becomes something else. It's not the absence of sound. It's a presence unto itself, like something watching and waiting." Another, from 6 months prior, third night. "Can't shake the feeling that the lighthouse is breathing. The walls expand and contract so subtly you can't see it, only feel it. Or maybe I'm just losing my mind. Hard to tell the difference out here." And then the most recent entry, dated just 2 weeks before my arrival. The handwriting was barely legible, the pen pressed so hard into the paper it had torn through in places. Day 4. Can't sleep. Every time I start to drift off, I hear it, that creak on the stairs. Same step every time. Third from the bottom. I've checked it a dozen times. During the day, it's silent. But at 3:47 a.m., without fail, that step creaks like someone standing on it. The silence is wrong. It's not empty. There are gaps in it, spaces where sound should be, but isn't. Like someone cut holes in reality, and the silence is bleeding through. The tower stairs creak at 3:47 a.m. every night. But when I check, there's nothing there. Starting to wonder if Morrison was right about this place. Starting to wonder if. The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page as if the writer had been interrupted or simply lost the will to continue. Or perhaps had been grabbed by something they hadn't seen coming. I closed the book firmly, telling myself that isolation clearly affected some people more than others. The previous keeper had obviously been someone prone to anxiety, to paranoid thinking. They'd let the solitude get to them, had started seeing patterns where none existed, hearing significance in random sounds. I was different. I'd wanted isolation. I'd sought it out deliberately. I wouldn't let my imagination run wild with ghost stories and superstition. But as darkness fell outside, as the automated beacon began its slow rotation and bars of light swept through the keeper's house every 30 seconds, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound. The wind whistling through gaps in the stone, the distant crash of waves, the settling of old wood and metal, all perfectly normal, perfectly explainable. So why couldn't I shake the feeling that something was listening? That first night taught me what Captain Morrison had meant about the difference between quiet and silence. The quiet came at dusk. It was peaceful, even beautiful. I'd made dinner, eaten while watching the sun set in spectacular fashion, the sky bleeding from gold to red to deep purple, painting the ocean in colors that seemed almost unreal. The wind had died down to a gentle breeze. The waves had softened to a rhythmic lullaby. I'd sat in the armchair by the window, a book open in my lap, and felt something close to contentment for the first time in 6 months. This was what I'd come here for. This peace. This separation from the chaos of my failed life. But the quiet didn't last. Around 10 p.m., I became aware that something had changed. The wind had stopped completely, not died down, but stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. The waves that had been providing constant background noise were suddenly muted, their crash and hiss barely audible. Even the gulls, which I'd heard calling to each other throughout the evening, had fallen completely silent. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was wrong. The silence pressed in from all sides, thick and heavy. It had weight, texture, presence. My ears actually hurt, the way they do when you're at high altitude or underwater, a pressure that made me want to yawn or swallow to pop them, except that didn't help. The silence wasn't outside my ears. It was inside them, pressing outward. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my book forgotten, straining to hear anything. The wood stove ticked softly as it cooled down. My own breathing seemed thunderously loud. The beacon rotated overhead, its mechanism making the faintest mechanical hum that I'd never noticed before, but which now seemed to fill the entire house. And underneath it all, or perhaps woven through it, there was something else. Not quite a sound, not quite the absence of sound. An awareness, maybe. A sense that the silence wasn't empty but occupied, like a room you know has someone in it even though you can't see them. I tried to read, but the words wouldn't stick in my mind. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous, that this was just what real isolation felt like, and my city-conditioned brain was struggling to adjust. But the rational explanations felt hollow, thin, like paper masks over something much darker. At 3:47 a.m., I jerked awake. I hadn't meant to fall asleep. I'd been sitting in the armchair, determined to stay awake and prove to myself there was nothing to fear. But exhaustion had claimed me anyway, pulling me down into an uneasy doze filled with dreams I couldn't quite remember upon waking. The house was dark except for the sweeping bars of light from the beacon above. 30 seconds of darkness, then a brief flash of illumination as the beam passed through. Darkness, light, darkness, light. The rhythm was hypnotic and somehow menacing. That's when I heard it. Creak. The sound came from the spiral staircase that led up into the lighthouse tower. Just one step, the distinctive sound of weight on old metal. Then silence again, that heavy, oppressive silence that had become my new reality. I sat frozen in my chair, every muscle tense, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Old buildings settle. Metal expands and contracts with temperature changes. The wind, even though there wasn't any wind. A bird landing on something outside. Anything. But that sound had been deliberate, purposeful. The distinct creak of someone placing their weight on a metal step. Hello. My voice came out weak, uncertain. I cleared my throat and tried again. Is someone there? The silence swallowed my words without echo. The beacon flashed, momentarily illuminating the base of the spiral stairs. Empty. Just old metal steps disappearing up into shadow. I should have stayed in my chair. Should have waited for morning, for daylight to burn away the supernatural dread that had settled over me. But I couldn't. The not knowing was somehow worse than confronting whatever had made that sound. I turned on every light in the keeper's house. The ceiling light, the lamp by my chair, even the small light over the kitchen sink. I flooded the space with illumination, pushing back the darkness and the crawling fear that came with it. Then I approached the spiral staircase. The beam from my flashlight swept across the steps as I climbed slowly, listening hard. Nothing but my own footfalls, my own breathing. The steps were solid beneath my feet, showing no signs of instability or damage that might cause random noises. I counted as I climbed. Third step from the bottom. I paused there, placed my weight on it carefully. Creak. The exact same sound I'd heard from the chair. Relief washed through me, followed immediately by embarrassment. It was just the stairs. Thermal contraction causing metal to make noise at predictable times. Completely mundane. Nothing supernatural, nothing sinister. I was about to head back down, laughing at my own foolishness, when I heard something else. It came from above, from somewhere higher in the lighthouse tower. A soft sound, barely audible, that might have been wind whistling through a crack in the stone. Might have been metal settling. Might have been dozens of perfectly normal things. But it sounded, just for a moment, exactly like someone laughing softly. I stood frozen on that third step, my flashlight beam pointed up into the darkness above, seeing nothing but the spiral of stairs disappearing into shadow. My heart was racing again. That momentary relief burned away by a renewed surge of primal fear. "Who's there?" I called up into the darkness. Nothing. Just silence, heavy and waiting. I didn't go any higher. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get off those stairs, to get back to the relative safety of the living area, to not challenge whatever might be waiting in the darkness above. I went back down, returned to my chair, and sat there with all the lights blazing until dawn broke gray and cold over the Atlantic. I didn't sleep again that night. Didn't even try. Just sat and listened to the silence and wondered what the hell I'd gotten myself into. The second day was worse precisely because nothing happened. I'd slept fitfully through the afternoon, exhaustion finally overriding anxiety. When I woke, disoriented and cotton-mouthed, the sun was already setting. I'd lost most of the daylight hours to restless sleep, full of dreams I couldn't quite remember, but which left me feeling unsettled and watched. I made dinner mechanically, opening cans, heating things on the wood stove without really tasting what I ate. My mind kept returning to that sound on the stairs, to that soft laugh that might have been nothing at all. In daylight, or at least the fading remnants of it, the fear seemed absurd. I was a grown man, alone on an island, letting my imagination run wild because I'd read some unsettling log entries and heard a perfectly explainable noise. But as night fell again, as that oppressive silence settled over the island like a shroud, the rational explanations felt less convincing. I was determined not to repeat the previous night's paranoia. I'd stay up. Yes, my sleep schedule was already inverted anyway, but I'd keep busy. Write in the log book. Read. Maybe clean or organize something. Anything to occupy my mind and prevent it from spiraling into supernatural dread. At 3:45 a.m., I was sitting at the desk, the logbook open before me as I recorded the day's weather observations. Clear skies, mild temperatures for the season, wind from the northwest at approximately 10 knots. All very ordinary and routine. But my hand was shaking as I wrote, the pen making the words barely legible. Because I knew what was coming. I was watching the clock on the wall, counting down the minutes. 3:46 a.m. This was ridiculous. I was a rational adult, not a child afraid of monsters under the bed. There was no reason to think that sound would repeat. Even if it did, I'd already determined it was just thermal contraction. Nothing sinister, nothing. 3:47 a.m. Creak. The same step. Third from the bottom. The exact same sound. My pen froze midword. Every muscle in my body tensed. It was just the temperature change, I told myself. Just physics, mundane and explainable. But my body didn't believe my mind. My body knew, on some primal level, that something was wrong. This time, I didn't freeze. I didn't sit paralyzed in my chair waiting for morning. Anger bubbled up through the fear. Anger at my own weakness, at the situation, at whoever or whatever was messing with my head. I grabbed my flashlight, stood up with enough force to send my chair scraping across the floor, and walked directly to the stairs. "All right," I said aloud, my voice sounding braver than I felt. "Let's see what you've got." I placed my foot on the third step from the bottom and put my full weight on it. Creak. The exact same sound. The same pitch, the same duration. I did it again. Same result. And just like that, the supernatural dread evaporated, replaced by sheepish embarrassment. It was just a squeaky step. That's all. Old metal making old metal sounds at regular intervals because of temperature changes or humidity or whatever. The previous keeper had let it get to them, had built it up into something ominous, and I'd been on the verge of doing the same thing. I even laughed, a short, sharp bark of laughter at my own foolishness. The sound echoed up into the lighthouse tower, and from somewhere above, barely audible, came what might have been an echo of my own laughter, or might have been something else laughing back. I stood very still on that third step, my flashlight pointed up into the darkness. The laughter, if it had even been laughter, didn't repeat. But I could feel something, not quite a presence, more like an absence where a presence should be, a void in the shape of something aware. I didn't go up the stairs that night. I went back to my chair and sat there until dawn, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the quality of silence. When morning finally came, I made a decision. I would search the keeper's house from top to bottom, find the source of these sounds, these feelings, prove to myself, once and for all, that there was nothing here but old stone, old metal, and my own overactive imagination. What I found instead were the photographs. The photographs were in a storage closet I'd barely glanced at during my initial exploration of the keeper's house. I'd been looking for extra blankets. The nights were colder than I'd anticipated, and the thin wool blanket on my bed wasn't quite enough when I knocked over a cardboard box that had been shoved far back into the shadows. Old photographs spilled across the floor, dozens of them, maybe 100. They were in various states of preservation, some yellowed and brittle with age, others more recent but still clearly vintage. Most showed lighthouse keepers throughout Beacon Point's long history, standing proudly beside the tower or posed formally in their uniforms. There were group shots too, multiple keepers together, some with families, wives and children who'd apparently lived on this isolated rock for periods of time, back when the lighthouse was fully staffed and operational. I gathered them up, intending to put them back in the box, when one photograph caught my attention and held it. It was older than most of the others, the edges crumbling, the surface yellowed and cracked with age. Based on the clothing and the quality of the image, I guessed it was from the 1920s. It showed a man, youngish, maybe early 30s, with dark hair and an earnest face, standing at the base of the spiral staircase. He was looking up into the lighthouse tower, and his expression was one of absolute, visceral terror. His mouth was open mid-scream, his eyes wide with a horror so profound it seemed to radiate from the photograph itself. One hand was raised, as if to ward something off. And there, on the stairs behind him, barely visible in the aged and damaged photograph, was something else. A shape, pale, humanoid, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Its proportions were off, limbs too long, joints bending in ways joints shouldn't bend, a head that tilted at an angle that would break a human neck. The more I looked at it, the less sense it made. My eyes couldn't quite focus on it properly, kept sliding off its edges as if my brain refused to fully process what it was seeing. It could have been a trick of light, I told myself. A chemical error in the development process, damage to the photograph over decades of storage. The image was old and degraded. It could have been anything, but I knew what I was seeing. And I knew, with a certainty that bypassed all rational thought, that the keeper in the photograph had heard that same creak on the third step from the bottom, had felt that same oppressive silence pressing in from all sides, had climbed those stairs to investigate, just as I had almost done, and had found something waiting. My hands were trembling as I turned the photograph over, looking for any identifying information. There was a date written in faded pencil, October 15th, 1923. Below it, in a different hand, someone had written, Thomas Hartley. Last photograph taken. Disappeared 3 days later. Body never recovered. I dropped the photograph as if it had burned me. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up, that terrified keeper staring up at me from across a century of time. The pale shape behind him seemed clearer now, more defined, as if acknowledging that I'd seen it had somehow given it more substance. I backed away from the scattered photographs, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This was insane. I was letting fear and isolation warp my perception, seeing patterns and meaning where none existed. There were 1,000 explanations for why a keeper might have disappeared in 1923. Accident, illness, suicide, a decision to fake his death and start over somewhere else. The photograph was damaged, nothing more. That pale shape was light damage or chemical degradation or my own imagination filling in details that weren't really there. But I couldn't make myself believe it. I spent the rest of that day going through all the photographs methodically, documenting what I found. Not all of them were disturbing. Most were exactly what they appeared to be, historical records of the lighthouse and its various keepers over the decades. But there were others, scattered throughout the collection, that made my skin crawl. A keeper from 1937, standing in the beacon room at the top of the tower, turned to look over his shoulder at something the camera couldn't quite capture. His face showed confusion and the first stirrings of fear. Two keepers from 1952, posing together at the base of the lighthouse. In the window behind them, barely visible, was a pale smudge that might have been a face pressed against the glass, or might have been nothing at all. A keeper from 1968, alone in the living area where I now sat. The photograph seemed normal at first glance, but if you looked carefully at the mirror hanging on the wall behind him, you could see that it reflected something that wasn't in the room. Something pale and wrong standing just behind where the camera must have been positioned. And more recent ones too. A keeper from just 5 years ago, photographed, apparently by himself, a selfie of sorts, in the beacon room. He was smiling, But in the curved glass of the lighthouse lens behind him, distorted and stretched by the curvature, but unmistakable once you saw it, was that same pale shape. Closer, more defined, more real. With each photograph I examined, a pattern emerged. The pale shape, whatever it was, appeared more clearly, more solidly, in the more recent images, as if it was becoming stronger over time, more able to manifest, more present in the world. Or perhaps keepers were simply getting better cameras, I told myself desperately. Better film, better development processes that captured more detail. That was all. Nothing supernatural, just improving technology documenting what had always been there. Light damage, lens flares, processing errors. But I couldn't make myself believe that either. As afternoon bled into evening, as the automated beacon began its nightly rotation and the silence started to settle over the island like a fog, I made a decision. I had to know. Whatever was happening here, whether it was real or just my mind fracturing under isolation, I couldn't spend another 2.5 weeks cowering in this chair, waiting for 3:47 a.m. and that inevitable creak. Tonight, I would climb the stairs. I would go all the way to the top, into the beacon room. I would prove to myself that there was nothing there but machinery and glass and the endless rotation of light warning ships away from rocks. And if there was something more, well, at least I'd know. At least I wouldn't be trapped in this awful uncertainty, this space between rational skepticism and primal fear. At 3:45 a.m., I stood at the base of the spiral staircase, my flashlight in one hand and a heavy wrench from the maintenance toolkit in the other. I'd chosen the wrench more for psychological comfort than any practical defensive purpose. If there really was something up there, something that existed outside normal physical reality, a wrench wasn't going to help. But it gave my hands something to do, something to hold on to besides fear. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to stop, to get out, to radio Morrison right now and get off this godforsaken rock immediately. But I was tired of being afraid, tired of running from things, from my failed business, from my collapsed marriage, from the wreckage of who I used to be. I'd come here to confront myself, hadn't I? To face my demons in isolation? Well, maybe there were more demons here than I'd anticipated. 3:46 a.m. I started climbing before I could change my mind. The metal steps rang out beneath my feet, each footfall announcing my presence to whatever might be waiting above. My flashlight beam danced across the curved stone walls, creating moving shadows that my imagination wanted to interpret as something more sinister. 10 steps. 20. The main living area fell away below me as I climbed higher into the tower's core. 30 steps. 40. The spiral seemed to go on forever, corkscrewing up through darkness punctuated only by my flashlight and the periodic sweep of the beacon's light filtering down from above. 3:47 a.m. I heard it below me, that creak from the third step, but I was already far past that point, climbing higher. The sound echoed up the spiral, chasing me. 50 steps. 60. My legs were burning now, my breath coming hard. How tall was this lighthouse? It hadn't seemed this tall from outside, but the stairs kept spiraling upward, disappearing into darkness that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. Finally, after what felt like hundreds of steps, but was probably closer to 80 or 90, I emerged into the beacon room. It was a circular space, maybe 20 feet in diameter, surrounded by windows that looked out over the black expanse of the Atlantic. The automated beacon system dominated the center of the room, a massive lens assembly that rotated slowly on its motorized base, gathering and focusing light into the powerful beam that swept across the water every 30 seconds. The machinery hummed softly, a sound I'd been hearing distantly for days, but which now filled the space with its mechanical rhythm. I swept my flashlight around the room. Everything looked normal. Old but well-maintained equipment. Windows that needed cleaning but were intact. A few spider webs in the corners. Nothing supernatural, nothing sinister. Just a functional lighthouse beacon doing its job. Relief started to seep through me, warm and loosening muscles I hadn't realized were tense to the point of cramping. There was nothing here. Nothing but my own fear and an overactive imagination fed by suggestive photographs and creepy log entries. I'd let isolation get to me, had started seeing patterns where none existed. See, I said aloud, my voice steady now, even a bit amused at my own expense. Nothing, just an old lighthouse doing lighthouse things. Then my flashlight beam swept across the far side of the room, and caught something I hadn't noticed before. A door. It was set flush into the stone wall, painted the same color as the stone, so it was nearly invisible unless you were looking directly at it. There was no handle, just a slight depression where fingers could grip and pull. I stood frozen, staring at it. That door wasn't on any of the blueprints I'd reviewed before taking this job. The beacon room was supposed to be the top of the structure. There was nothing above this space. Nothing. So why was there a door? I should have left then. Every horror story I'd ever read, every scary movie I'd ever watched, every campfire tale about people investigating things they shouldn't, they all pointed to this as the moment of no return. The protagonist always opens the door, always goes into the space that shouldn't exist, and that's always when everything goes truly, irrevocably wrong. But I'd already come this far, and the not knowing, the uncertainty, was somehow worse than whatever might be on the other side of that door. My hand reached for it before my mind had fully made the decision. The stone was cold under my fingers, smooth and slightly damp. I pulled. The door swung open silently. Far too silently for something that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades, revealing a narrow ladder leading upward into complete darkness, into a space that, according to every blueprint and floor plan, shouldn't exist. My flashlight beam probed upward but couldn't reach whatever was at the top of that ladder. The darkness seemed to swallow the light, to drink it in without reflection. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to close that door, to leave, to get off this island immediately and never come back. Instead, I started climbing. The ladder was made of old iron, rough with rust under my hands. Each rung creaked softly as I put my weight on it, the sound echoing in the narrow shaft. 10 rungs. 15. 20. How far up could this possibly go? The lighthouse didn't have another level. It couldn't. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 or 40 rungs, my head emerged into another space. I pulled myself up the last few steps and stood, my flashlight sweeping across what I'd found. A room. Circular, like the beacon room below, but smaller. Maybe 8 feet in diameter. The ceiling was low enough that I had to hunch slightly to avoid hitting my head on the curved stone. There were no windows, no source of natural light. Just stone walls and a floor that was covered in a thick layer of dust. And photographs, covering every surface. The walls, the ceiling, even parts of the floor where they'd been laid out in careful patterns. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all tacked or glued or otherwise affixed to the stone, creating a collage of faces and moments that spanned decades. I moved my flashlight slowly across them, my breath catching in my throat as I understood what I was seeing. Every photograph showed a lighthouse keeper, and every keeper was captured in a moment of absolute terror. Some were screaming, their mouths open in silent cries my ears couldn't hear, but which I could somehow feel resonating through the images. Others were frozen in shock, their faces slack with a horror so complete it had short-circuited normal expression. A few were trying to run, caught mid-stride, looking back over their shoulders at something the camera couldn't quite capture. But if you looked carefully, and once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The pale shape was in every single photograph. Sometimes in the background, a blurred smudge that might have been anything. Sometimes closer, more defined, reaching toward the keeper with those too long limbs and too many jointed fingers. And in some of the more recent photographs, it was right behind them, pressed up against their backs like a shadow that had learned to take physical form. The photographs created a timeline, I realized. A chronological record of every keeper who'd stayed on Beacon Point, showing their progression from confidence to concern to fear to absolute, mind-breaking terror. And at the end of each keeper sequence, there was always a final photograph, the one where the pale shape was fully visible, fully present, merged with the keeper or consuming them or becoming them. I couldn't tell which. Names and dates were written beneath many of the photographs in various hands. Thomas Hartley, 1923. Eugene Morrison, 1937. James Patterson, 1952. Eleanor Rodriguez, 1968. David Chun, 1991. On and on, dozens of names spanning a century, all ending the same way. And at the center of this shrine, because that's what it was, I realized, a shrine or perhaps a trophy room. There was a blank space. An area of empty stone wall, conspicuously clear of photographs. Waiting for new images. Waiting for me. That's when I heard it. Not from below this time, but from right behind me in this impossible room that shouldn't exist. The sound I'd heard that second night, the one I'd convinced myself was just wind or settling metal or anything mundane. Laughter. Soft, barely audible, but definitely laughter. I spun around, my flashlight cutting wild arcs through the darkness and across the photograph-covered walls. Nothing. Just more images of terrified keepers, and that pale shape growing progressively more solid, more real, through the decades. But the temperature had dropped precipitously. My breath came out in thick clouds of condensation. The air itself felt wrong. Too thick, too heavy, pressing against me from all sides like I was deep underwater. And in my breath, in that condensation hanging in the beam of my flashlight, I could see it forming. The pale shape was assembling itself out of nothing, constructing a body from cold air and darkness and whatever belief or fear existed in this space. It started as wisps of vapor that moved against the still air, coalescing and solidifying. The wrong proportions became more apparent as it took form. Limbs that bent in ways limbs shouldn't bend, a torso that was simultaneously too long and too compressed, a head that tilted at an angle that should have snapped the neck, but which somehow worked for this thing's alien geometry. And its face. God, its face. It had no features, not exactly. No eyes or nose or mouth in the traditional sense. But there were depressions where eyes might be, and in those depressions was something worse than emptiness. They held all the darkness of the Atlantic at midnight, all the cold of water that never saw sunlight, all the silence of spaces where sound went to die. I understood then, in a moment of terrible clarity, what this place was, what this island was. Beacon Point wasn't just isolated from the world. It had been isolated for something. A feeding ground, a trap, a place where something ancient and patient had been waiting in the silence between sounds, growing stronger with each keeper who came, who heard the creak on the stairs, who climbed to investigate, who fed it with their fear until there was nothing left of them but photographs on a wall. The pale shape moved toward me, not walking, exactly, more like flowing through space without actually traversing the distance between. One moment, it was forming near the far wall. The next, it was inches from my face, those terrible knot eyes boring into me, and I could feel it reaching into my mind, searching through my memories and fears like someone rifling through drawers looking for something valuable to steal. It found plenty to work with. My failed business, my collapsed marriage, my sense of complete inadequacy and failure. Every moment of shame and regret, every fear about who I was and what I'd become. The pale shape took it all, pulled it out of me like pulling organs from a body, examined each piece of my psyche with cold, alien interest. And it was hungry, so terribly hungry. It had been feeding on keepers for a century, but it wanted more, needed more. Each keeper made it stronger, more able to manifest, more real. And I was the next course in a banquet that had been going on since 1923. I ran. I flew back down that ladder so fast I barely touched the rungs, my hands and feet finding purchase through pure panic. I burst back into the beacon room, stumbled through it, and hit the spiral stairs at a dead run, taking steps 3 and 4 at a time. Behind me, or was it all around me, in the very air itself, I could feel it following. Not with footsteps or sound, but with that oppressive silence, that absence of sound that was more terrifying than any noise could be. The silence was its medium, I understood now. The spaces between sounds where it lived and moved and fed. And this island, 12 miles from any other human being, surrounded by ocean that muffled sound and 8 voices, was perfect for it. A bubble of isolation where silence reigned and it could hunt without interference. I hit the bottom of the stairs and kept going, through the keeper's house, out the door, stumbling across the rocky ground in the darkness. The beacon's light swept overhead every 30 seconds, illuminating nothing but empty rock and churning sea and my own desperate flight toward absolutely nowhere. Because there was nowhere to run. The island was tiny, 200 yards across at its widest point, and beyond it was only the Atlantic, cold and vast and indifferent. I could see my supplies stacked near the dock, everything I needed to survive 3 weeks. 3 weeks before Morrison would return. I had been here 5 days. 18 more days of this. 18 more days trapped on this rock with that thing, with that impossible room full of photographs documenting a century of victims. 18 more days of 3:47 a.m. and the creak on the stairs and the silence that pressed in from all sides. I couldn't do it. I'd go insane. Or worse. I'd end up like Thomas Hartley and all the others, my face added to that collection, my terror preserved in chemical and paper for the next keeper to find. I was standing at the edge of the rocks, looking down at the churning water 40 feet below, seriously contemplating jumping, when I heard it. A boat engine. Impossibly, incredibly, a boat engine cutting through the sound of waves and wind. I turned, hardly daring to believe it, and saw lights moving across the dark water. Morrison's Coast Guard vessel, running lights blazing, cutting through the darkness toward the dock. I ran, waving my arms, shouting though I knew he couldn't hear me yet. My voice felt strange, hoarse, like I'd been screaming though I couldn't remember doing so. The boat pulled up to the dock. Morrison killed the engine, and I practically fell into his arms. "Had a feeling," he said, his voice grim as he steadied me. His face was deeply lined, his gray eyes holding something like pity and something else, maybe guilt. "Previous keeper made it 4 days. You lasted 5. That's something, I suppose." "There's something up there," I gasped, my words tumbling over each other. "In a room that shouldn't exist. Photographs. All the missing keepers. It's been feeding on them, on us. On fear. It's real, Morrison. It's actually real, and it's been here for—" "I know," Morrison said quietly, his voice cutting through my panicked rambling. He handed me a blanket and guided me to sit on one of the benches built into the boat's deck. "I know about the room. The photographs. The pale shape in the silence." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he'd just said. You know? Then why do you keep sending people out here?" "What?" Morrison wouldn't meet my eyes. He busied himself with casting off from the dock, starting the engine, pointing the boat back toward the mainland. Only when we were moving, the lighthouse growing smaller behind us, did he speak again. "I lasted 2 weeks myself, 15 years ago," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine. "Longest anyone's made it since the 40s. I saw the photographs, the room, the shape and the silence. I know exactly what you experienced." "Then why?" My voice broke. "Why do you keep sending people to feed that thing?" Morrison's hands tightened on the wheel. "Because it needs to feed. And better to feed it those who come looking for isolation, who won't be missed right away, than have it come ashore looking for prey in the towns." The implications of what he was saying crashed over me like the waves that rocked the boat. You're deliberately sacrificing people. You're complicit in. I'm keeping hundreds of people safe." Morrison's composure cracked for just a moment, and I saw the weight of guilt and rationalization he'd been carrying for 15 years. "Do you have any idea what it did before we started the Keeper program? In 1923, it came ashore. 17 people disappeared from Harwich Point in 2 days. Men, women, children. Disappeared without a trace. We didn't know what was happening until Thomas Hartley figured out it was coming from Beacon Point." "Thomas Hartley," I whispered, remembering the name on the photograph. "The first keeper." Morrison nodded, his face aging a decade in the dim light from the boat's instruments. "He volunteered, went out to the lighthouse to investigate, and found it. Found the thing that had been living there, growing stronger on shipwrecks and drownings and the fear of sailors who died on those rocks. He made a deal with it, or maybe he didn't have a choice. He went up into that room and stayed there, kept it company with his fear, fed it enough to keep it satisfied so it wouldn't need to come back to town. And now he's part of it," I said, seeing again in my mind those photographs where Hartley's face appeared in the background, watching, warning, trapped. "Not dead, not exactly," Morrison continued, "but not alive either. Part of the entity now, part of what keeps it bound to the island. As long as the Keeper program continues, as long as people come regularly to feed it, it stays on Beacon Point. The moment we stop—" He trailed off, but I could imagine the rest. We rode in silence for a while, the lighthouse fading to a pale finger in the darkness behind us. I was safe now, getting farther from that thing with every passing minute. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that I'd been marked by my time in that impossible room. "What happens to the keepers who don't make it?" I asked. "The ones who disappear? Thomas Hartley, and whoever else. They become part of it," Morrison said flatly. "Their consciousness, their fear, their essence, whatever you want to call it. The thing absorbs them, adds them to its collection. Most keepers last a few days and leave before that happens. They get scared, they radio for pickup, and they get off the island shaken but alive. But a few, every few years, stay too long. Get too curious. Climb to that room and don't come back down." Jesus Christ. I felt sick. How many? Over the years, how many people have been sacrificed to that thing? Morrison didn't answer, which was answer enough. As we approached the mainland, the lights of Harwich Point growing larger and more welcoming, Morrison turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You'll be compensated well," he said. "Hazard pay, bonus for lasting as long as you did. And there are papers you'll need to sign, confidentiality agreements, non-disclosure forms. Most keepers do. Where else are you going to tell your story without being locked up in a psych ward?" He was right, and I hated him for it. Who would believe me? I'd been a broken man seeking isolation, seeking to escape my failures. The perfect candidate for a psychotic break. If I tried to tell anyone what I'd experienced, what I'd seen, they'd assume it was trauma-induced hallucination, isolation psychosis, a mind fragmenting under stress. No one would believe in the pale shape in the silence, the impossible room full of photographs, the thing that had been feeding on keepers for a century. No one except the people of Harwich Point, who already knew and had chosen to accept it as the cost of their safety. I signed the papers, of course. What choice did I have? Morrison set me up in a motel on the mainland, paid for 2 weeks up front. "Rest, recover, try to forget," he said, though we both knew forgetting was impossible. Some experiences don't fade with time. They burrow deep, make a home in your psyche, change the fundamental way you see the world. For 3 days, I barely left the motel room. I kept the TV on constantly, the volume turned up, anything to fill the silence. I couldn't stand quiet anymore. The absence of sound had become threatening, pregnant with possibility. Every time the noise died down, even for a moment, I could feel it, that sense of being watched, of something waiting just beyond perception. On the 4th day, I forced myself outside. The small coastal town of Harwich Point seemed aggressively, almost defiantly normal. People walked dogs. Children played in yards. A couple argued about groceries outside the general store. Life, mundane and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the horror that existed just 12 miles offshore. I found myself drawn to the local library, a small brick building that smelled of old paper and floor polish. If Morrison was telling the truth about the 1923 incidents, there would be records, evidence, something to prove I hadn't simply had a psychotic break. The librarian was a woman in her 70s with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She watched me enter with barely concealed interest, and I realized with a start that she knew who I was. "You're the new keeper," she said. It wasn't a question. "Saw Morrison bring you back 3 days ago. You lasted longer than the last one." "That's good. That's very good." I stared at her. "You know about." "Everyone in Harwich knows, dear," she interrupted, her voice pitched low enough not to carry to the other few patrons scattered through the library. "We don't talk about it with outsiders, but among ourselves, it's an open secret. Has been for 100 years. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume of archived newspapers from beneath the desk, as if she'd been expecting me. "You want to see the records from 1923? The disappearances." She opened the volume to October of that year. The headline made my blood run cold despite the warm afternoon. "Mysterious disappearances plague Harwich Point. 17 missing in 48 hours. Authorities baffled as residents vanish without trace." The article described a wave of vanishings that had struck the town without warning over the course of 2 days. People had disappeared from their homes, their shops, even from the street in broad daylight. No bodies were ever found, no clues as to what had happened. Witnesses described a creeping cold settling over the town, an oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides, and, in several cases, a pale figure that seemed to drift through Harwich like fog, there one moment and gone the next. The article listed the missing, 7 adults, 6 children, for teenagers. Names, ages, brief descriptions of who they'd been. Real people with real lives, erased in an instant. Thomas Hartley was a local boy, the librarian said softly. 28 years old, bright, educated. He'd studied folklore and the occult at university. Unusual for the time, but Thomas was always unusual. When he figured out the thing was coming from Beacon Point, when he understood what it was, he volunteered to become the keeper. She paused, her weathered hand resting on the old newspaper. He said he'd keep it occupied, keep it fed with his fears so it wouldn't need to come back to town. He went up into that tower in October 1923 and never came down. But the disappearances stopped. Morrison said Hartley's still there. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. still aware somehow. I saw him in the photographs, in the background of images from different decades. Like he's been there the whole time, trapped. The librarian nodded, unsurprised. Every keeper who's lasted more than a few days reports the same thing. They see him in the photographs, not just in the old ones from 1923, but in the new ones too. Standing in the background, watching. His face always has the same expression, like he's trying to warn them, but can't quite manage it. She turned to the next page, showing Thomas Hartley's obituary. The cause of death was listed as accidental drowning. The body never recovered. A polite fiction. I flipped through more pages, following the story. The newspapers documented the establishment of the Keeper program in 1924, though of course they didn't call it that. It was framed as a preservation effort, maintaining the historic lighthouse. Wanted ads appeared regularly. Lighthouse keeper sought for Beacon Point Light Station. Experience unnecessary. Solitude and self-sufficiency required. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Regular keeper positions advertised to transients, loners, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. Most lasted less than a week before requesting early pickup. Some disappeared entirely, their absences explained away as having left the island on passing boats or having fallen into the sea. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Morrison said there were confidentiality agreements. Legal consequences for talking about what happens out there. The librarian smiled, but it was a grim expression. Those agreements are to keep outsiders from learning the truth, to protect the town from questions we can't answer without sounding insane. But you're not an outsider anymore, Mr. Webb. You've been touched by it. You're part of Harwich now, whether you like it or not. She leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. And some of us think the arrangement has gone on long enough. 100 years of feeding people to that thing. There has to be another way. Morrison said it would come ashore if we stopped. I protested, though I wasn't sure why. I was defending the man who'd knowingly sent me into danger. That it would hunt in the towns again. Morrison is protecting his town the only way he knows how, the librarian said. But he's also protecting that thing. He's become its priest, its shepherd, ensuring it has a steady supply of victims. Her eyes held mine, sharp and challenging. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I left the library with my head spinning, a folder full of photocopied articles tucked under my arm. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far from Harwich Point and Beacon Point and this whole nightmare as possible. Return to the mainland, lose myself in a city, surround myself with noise and people and light so that silence could never find me again. But another part of me, the part that had climbed those stairs despite every instinct screaming at me to flee, couldn't let it go. Couldn't accept that this was just how things were. That people would continue to be sacrificed to that thing for another 100 years because no one was brave enough or desperate enough or stupid enough to try another way. That night, back in my motel room, I spread out everything I'd learned. The newspaper articles, the photographs I'd managed to take on my phone before fleeing the lighthouse. Though they were mostly blurry, my hands had been shaking so badly. My memories of that impossible room at the top of the tower. There had to be a pattern, some logic to what the entity was, what it wanted, how it could be stopped. I thought about the photographs covering the walls of that hidden room. The progression they showed, confidence to concern to fear to absolute terror. The way the pale shape seemed more solid, more real in the more recent images. It fed on fear, clearly, but there was something else. The silence, the absence of sound. It existed in the gaps, in the spaces between. And somehow, Thomas Hartley had learned to keep it contained, to satisfy it enough that it stayed on the island instead of hunting in populated areas. But at what cost? Hartley had been trapped in that place for a century, his consciousness absorbed into the entity, neither alive nor truly dead. And every keeper who came, who fed it with their fear, made it stronger. The Keeper program wasn't containing it, it was feeding it, helping it grow. At 3:47 a.m., I jerked awake in my chair. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had finally overwhelmed me. The motel room was dark except for the flickering light from the muted TV. And it was silent, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence I'd learned to fear. That's when I heard it, coming from outside my room. The creak of a metal step. No, that was impossible. I was on the mainland, miles from Beacon Point. There were no spiral staircases here, no lighthouse towers. It couldn't reach me here. Morrison had said as long as I left the island, I'd be safe. It couldn't. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in thick clouds of condensation. And in the mirror above the dresser, I saw it forming behind me. The pale shape, assembling itself from silence and shadow and the cold that shouldn't exist in a heated motel room. It had followed me. Or maybe distance didn't matter to something that existed in the spaces between sounds. Maybe leaving the island hadn't saved me at all. Maybe I'd been marked the moment I'd climbed those stairs, the moment I'd entered that impossible room and seen what no one was supposed to see. The pale shape in the mirror was more defined now than it had been in the lighthouse. As if my fear had fed it, strengthened it, made it more real. Its not eyes fixed on me, and I felt that terrible pressure in my mind again. Cold, vast, searching through my thoughts and memories like fingers rifling through drawers. I ran, burst out of the motel room into the parking lot, gasping in the warm night air. Behind me, through the open door, I could see the temperature fog rolling out, condensation forming in impossible clouds. Other motel guests were emerging from their rooms, drawn by my panicked exit and the commotion. "You okay, buddy?" A trucker in a worn flannel shirt called from his doorway, concern creasing his weathered face. Before I could answer, Morrison's pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, gravel crunching under its tires. He got out slowly, his face grave in the harsh fluorescent lights of the motel's exterior lamps. "Get in," he said simply. I didn't move. It was in my room. "How is that possible?" "You said leaving the island would." I said most keepers are fine once they leave. Morrison interrupted, his voice tight. "But you're different, Marcus. You went further than most. You saw the room, the photographs, the pattern. You understood something about what it is. And now it's marked you. It can find you anywhere there's silence enough for it to manifest." The implications crashed over me like a physical wave. So what? I can never have a quiet moment again. I have to live in constant noise for the rest of my life. Always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for it. Or you go back. Morrison's eyes held something I couldn't quite identify. Pity, calculation, desperation maybe. You go back to Beacon Point and you finish what you started. You face it properly this time. You give it what it wants completely, feed it until it's satisfied. Then maybe it'll consider the debt paid and leave you alone. You're insane. I took a step back. I die up there. Everyone who's tried to last the full 3 weeks has either run away or disappeared. No one survives that long with that thing. Because they run, Morrison said, moving closer. Because they give in to fear and flee. But what if someone stayed? What if someone faced it down, gave it what it wanted on their terms rather than running like prey? He paused, his voice dropping. Thomas Hartley did it. Sacrificed himself to protect this town. Maybe it's time someone did it again. Maybe it's time someone replaced him. "You want me to take Hartley's place," I said slowly, the horror of what he was suggesting settling over me. To become part of that thing. To spend eternity trapped in that room, neither alive nor dead, just existing in silence. "I want you to end this," a new voice interrupted. I turned to see the librarian standing at the edge of the parking lot, and she wasn't alone. A dozen townspeople had gathered, their faces hard with determination in the flickering motel lights. They must have been watching, waiting for this confrontation. Morrison won't say it plainly. The librarian continued, moving forward. "But I will. The entity is getting stronger. Keepers used to last 4 or 5 days easily. Now they barely make it 3. Some don't make it 2. It's evolving, learning, growing. Soon feeding it won't be enough to keep it contained. It'll come ashore again, and next time it won't stop at 17 victims. So your solution is to sacrifice me?" My voice came out higher than I intended, edged with panic. "Send me back up there to die, or worse?" "Our solution," the librarian said firmly, "is to give you a choice, and to give you the tools to make that choice informed." She pulled something from the pocket of her cardigan, a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn with age. Thomas Hartley kept notes before he went up to that room for the final time. "We found this hidden in his family's attic 15 years ago, after his sister died. Morrison's kept it locked away, but I think you should have it." Morrison started to protest, but the librarian cut him off with a sharp look. "Enough, Daniel. 100 years of feeding people to that thing, and what has it gotten us? A monster at our doorstep that grows hungrier every year, stronger with each keeper. If Marcus is willing to try another way, we should help him." I took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was worn smooth by time, the pages yellowed and brittle. Thomas Hartley's handwriting filled the interior, precise and controlled at first, then becoming increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. "Take tonight to read it," the librarian said softly. "Tomorrow, decide. But decide quickly, Marcus. Every moment you wait, it grows stronger in the silence around you. Right now, it can only manifest for brief periods. But soon." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I spent the rest of that night in a 24-hour diner, surrounded by the clatter of dishes, the murmur of late-night conversations, the hiss of the grill, and the annoying but comforting buzz of fluorescent lights. Any sound to keep the silence at bay. And I read Thomas Hartley's journal from cover to cover, learning things I wished I didn't know. Hartley hadn't been just a brave volunteer, I discovered. He'd been a researcher, a scholar of folklore and occult phenomena. He'd recognized the entity for exactly what it was, an egregore, a thought form given substance by collective belief and fear. It hadn't always existed, he wrote. It had been created, slowly, over centuries. The journal detailed his theory. Beacon Point had been a place of shipwrecks and drownings for as long as ships had sailed the Atlantic coast. Dozens of vessels had been dashed against those rocks, hundreds of sailors drowned in those cold waters. And with each death came fear. The terror of drowning, of being pulled down into dark water, of dying alone and lost. That fear had accumulated over time, layer upon layer, until it had achieved a kind of critical mass. At some point, Hartley estimated it was in the late 1700s or early 1800s, the accumulated fear had become something more. It had achieved consciousness, of a sort. Not human consciousness, but awareness nonetheless. An entity made of terror and silence and the cold darkness of deep water, given form by the belief of dying sailors that something malevolent lurked in the depths. Once it existed, it began to feed deliberately. It learned to call to ships, to lure them onto the rocks. It discovered that fear made it stronger, more solid, more real. The more people who believed in it, who feared it, the more powerful it became. By 1923, it had grown strong enough to leave its island, to manifest on the mainland and hunt actively. The 17 disappearances Hartley documented were its attempt to gather enough fear energy to become permanent, to no longer need the island as an anchor point. Hartley's solution had been radical and, I realized as I read, completely insane. He'd decided that if the entity fed on fear, then fear could also be used to control it, not by fighting it or running from it, but by understanding it, by accepting it, by becoming so intimate with it that the boundary between victim and entity dissolved. His final entries, written in the days before he climbed those stairs for the last time, were increasingly manic. October 19th, 1923. I understand now what must be done. The entity is not evil in any moral sense. It's simply is. It exists because we made it exist, because centuries of fear and death gave it shape and purpose. And that fear continues to empower it. But belief is a double-edged sword. If fear can create and strengthen it, then perhaps the right kind of belief can bind it, control it, even transform it. October 21st, 1923. I've been preparing the ritual. The symbols are painted. The words are memorized. I don't expect to survive this in any conventional sense, but perhaps some essential part of me will remain, enough to keep the binding strong, to keep the entity contained to the island. If I can believe strongly enough that I am not its victim, but its equal, its mirror, its other half, then perhaps I can trap it here through sheer force of will. October 22nd, 1923. Tomorrow night. I've said my goodbyes, though I couldn't explain where I'm really going or what I'm really doing. Mother thinks I'm simply taking the keeper position. She doesn't know it's permanent. God forgive me for the deception, but this is necessary. The thing must be bound, and I am the only one who understands how to do it. October 23rd, 1923. Tonight I ascend to the top room for the last time. I am not afraid, though perhaps I should be. I go willingly into the silence, taking with me all the fear it needs to stay satisfied, to stay bound to this place. If anyone reads this in future years, know that I go willingly into the darkness, and know that silence is not emptiness. It is the space where all things become possible, where the boundary between self and other dissolves. I do not expect to survive, but perhaps I will persist in some form, enough to maintain the binding, to keep Harwich Point safe from what I have helped to contain. This is my choice, my sacrifice. May God have mercy on what I am about to become. Thomas Hartley, October 23rd, 1923. The journal ended there. But tucked into the back pages, I found something else. Sheets of paper covered in symbols and diagrams. Instructions for a ritual. A binding. As dawn broke over Harwich Point, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made my decision. Morrison wasn't happy about my plan, but he couldn't exactly refuse. By noon, I was standing on the dock at Beacon Point once again, supplies stacked beside me. But this time, alongside the standard 3 weeks of food and water, I carried Thomas Hartley's journal, a box of salt, candles, a knife with a silver blade, a mirror, and something else the librarian had given me. A photograph of Thomas Hartley taken before his final ascent, showing a young man with intelligent eyes and a determined expression. A reminder that someone else had faced this thing and survived, after a fashion. You really think you can do what Hartley did? Morrison asked as he prepared to cast off. Bind it. Control it? He tried, and look what it cost him. A century trapped in that place, neither alive nor dead. Hartley succeeded, I corrected. He kept it contained for 100 years. I'm not trying to replace him. I'm trying to finish what he started. To reinforce the binding, strengthen it, maybe even find a way to weaken the entity enough that it can't hurt anyone anymore. Or you're going to make it stronger, Morrison said grimly. Feed it more fear, more consciousness, until it becomes unstoppable. Then you'll have to find another way. I met his eyes. But this ends one way or another in 3 weeks. Either I walk off this island alive, and that thing is bound so tightly it can never threaten anyone again, or I paused, letting the implication hang. Or you burn the whole structure to the waterline, salt the earth, and scatter the ashes. No more lighthouse, no more keepers, no more feeding it. Agreed. After a long moment, Morrison nodded slowly. Agreed. God help us both. I watched his boat disappear into the afternoon haze, then turned to face the lighthouse. In the daylight, it looked almost benign, just an old structure weathering slowly under wind and salt spray. But I knew what waited inside, in that impossible room at the top. I spent the first day and night preparing. Using the salt, I created protective circles and lines according to Hartley's diagrams, marking the floor of the top room, the space that shouldn't exist. I positioned the mirror to reflect the entrance, creating a symbolic boundary between inside and outside, self and other. The candles I placed at cardinal points, and the silver knife I laid across the threshold. All of it was symbolic, of course. The entity wasn't a demon to be banished by ritual and salt. But symbols have power when you believe in them. And if the entity fed on belief, on fear made manifest through conviction, then perhaps belief could also be weaponized against it. As night fell, I climbed the spiral stairs. My hand didn't shake this time. The creak on the third step from the bottom came right on schedule at 3:47 a.m., but I barely noticed it. I was focused, determined, ready. The door to the impossible room stood open, waiting. The photographs covering the walls seemed to watch me as I entered, hundreds of faces frozen in terror. But this time, I looked each one in the eye as I positioned myself in the center of the salt circle. This time, I acknowledged them, all those keepers who'd come before, whose fear had fed the entity and made it stronger. I see you, I said aloud. All of you. Thomas Hartley, Eugene Morrison, James Patterson, Eleanor Rodriguez, David Chun, and all the others whose names I don't know. You came here looking for something, peace, isolation, escape, and you found something else instead. Something that fed on you, that consumed your fear and left nothing but these images behind. The temperature began to drop. The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. But I'm not like you. I continued, my voice steady despite the cold. I understand what this thing is, and I'm not here to feed it anymore. I'm here to starve it. I sat down in the center of the salt circle, crossed my legs, and opened a book I'd brought with me. A collection of completely mundane short stories, nothing significant. And I began to read aloud. The entity manifested almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for me. The pale shape assembled itself from cold air and darkness, those wrong proportions becoming more defined than ever before. It was stronger now, I realized. My fear over the past week, my constant awareness of being hunted, had fed it, made it more solid, more real. It loomed over me, pressing down with that terrible psychic weight, showing me visions of previous keepers being torn apart, consumed, absorbed into its mass. It rifled through my memories, pulling out every failure, every regret, every moment of shame and inadequacy. My failed business played out in excruciating detail. Jennifer's face when she'd finally given up on us, when she'd realized I was beyond saving. My mother's worried voice on the phone, the disappointment she tried to hide. All of it was laid bare, examined, weaponized against me. But I kept reading, every word carefully pronounced, filling the silence with sound and meaning and the stubborn refusal to give the entity what it wanted. "You exist because we believe in you," I said, pausing in my reading. "Because generations of fear have given you shape and purpose. But belief is a choice, and I choose not to believe anymore." The entity raged silently around me. The photographs on the walls began to peel and curl, images writhing as if trying to escape their frames. Thomas Hartley's face appeared in dozens of them simultaneously, his expression shifting between warning and something that might have been hope. For hours, the entity pressed against me, trying to find a way in, trying to force me to acknowledge its power. But I kept reading, kept speaking, kept filling the silence with deliberately mundane words. When I finished one story, I started another. When my voice grew hoarse, I paused to drink water, then continued. As dawn broke, sending thin bars of light through gaps in the stone, the entity began to fade. Not much. It was far too strong for one night of resistance to destroy it, but it was weakening. The edges of its form were less solid, more transparent. And Thomas Hartley, when his face appeared in the photographs, looked almost hopeful. The second night was worse because the entity had learned from the first encounter. Instead of direct confrontation, it tried subtlety, manipulation. It whispered to me in voices I recognized. Jennifer, my mother, former business partners, speaking truths and half-truths designed to break my resolve. "You're a failure, Marcus," it said in Jennifer's voice. "You failed at business, failed at marriage, failed at life. What makes you think you can succeed at this?" "I'm worried about you, honey," it said in my mother's voice. "You're not well. You need help. Come home." I countered by agreeing with it. Yes, I'd failed. Yes, I was broken. Yes, I'd made terrible decisions and hurt people and lost everything that mattered. But that doesn't give you power over me, I said aloud. My failures are mine. My pain is mine, and I choose what I do with them. I choose not to feed them to you. The entity adapted again, showing me not horror, but beauty. It showed me memories of good times with Jennifer, of my business in its early success, of every moment of happiness I'd lost. It offered to take away the pain, to let me exist in those memories forever if I would just stop resisting, just give in. Those memories are mine too, I said. The joy and the pain, the success and the failure. All of it makes me human, and you can't have it. By the third night, I was exhausted but determined. The entity was visibly weakened, its form flickering like a failing light bulb. But it wasn't giving up. It couldn't afford to. I represented the first real threat to its existence in a century. That night, it showed me Thomas Hartley, not just his face in photographs, but all of him. The complete story of who he'd been and what he'd become. I saw him as a young man, brilliant and curious, studying forbidden texts and ancient folklore. I saw him discover the entity's existence, understand its nature, and make the decision to bind it. I saw him climb these stairs knowing he would never come down, carrying with him all the courage and terror of a man willingly walking to his own doom. And I saw what happened in this room that night in 1923. Hartley hadn't just fed the entity his fear, he'd offered himself completely, had deliberately merged his consciousness with it, becoming both prisoner and jailer, victim and guard. He'd bound the entity by becoming part of it, his human will acting as an anchor that kept it tied to the island. For 100 years, he'd maintained that binding. But the cost had been everything, his life, his death, his very existence caught in an eternal limbo between the two. He volunteered for this. The entity spoke for the first time in something other than stolen voices. Its voice was like wind through dead leaves, like water moving in deep caves. He thought he could save his town, but all he did was trap himself. And now you want to do the same? Or do you have another plan? Something you think will work where Hartley's solution failed? His solution didn't fail, I said quietly. It worked exactly as intended. He kept you bound here for a century, but bindings weaken over time. That's why you're stronger now, why keepers can't last as long. Hartley's will is fading, and without reinforcement, you'll soon break free completely. Yes, the entity admitted, and there was something like satisfaction in its voice. In another few years, perhaps less, I will be strong enough to leave this place. To hunt as I was meant to hunt. And there is nothing you can do to stop it. Maybe, I agreed. Or maybe I can do what Hartley did, but better. Maybe I can reinforce his binding, strengthen it, and then... I paused, looking directly at the pale shape. And then I can do something Hartley never thought to try. I can offer you a choice. The entity went very still, its attention focused on me with an intensity that was almost physical. You exist because we created you. I continued, speaking carefully. Centuries of fear and death gave you form. But what if we stopped? What if humanity as a whole simply chose not to believe in things like you anymore? You'd fade away, wouldn't you? Dissipate back into nothing. Fear is eternal, the entity said. As long as humans exist, they will fear. They will create things like me in their terror. I am inevitable. Maybe, I said again. But right now, in this moment, you have a choice. You can keep feeding on keepers, growing stronger, until you break free and hunt again. That's one path. Or, I took a deep breath. Or you can change, evolve, become something other than a predator. Impossible. But there was something in the entity's voice, curiosity perhaps, or the faintest hint of uncertainty. Is it? I reached into my pack and pulled out Thomas Hartley's photograph, the one taken before his final ascent. Hartley bound you by merging with you, becoming part of you. His humanity is woven through your existence now, whether you acknowledge it or not. And every keeper who's come here has added something too. Not just fear, but humanity, memory, experience. You're not just an egregore anymore. You're something more complex. I stood up, deliberately breaking the salt circle for the second time. The entity could have attacked then, could have consumed me easily, but it didn't move. I'm offering you a choice, I said. Keep hunting, keep feeding on fear, and eventually humanity will find a way to destroy you. We always do, eventually. Or accept that you've evolved beyond your original purpose. Accept the humanity that's been woven into your being through Hartley and all the others. And choose to be something different. What would I become? The entity's voice was softer now, almost uncertain. I don't know, I admitted. But it has to be better than this. Better than being a predator locked in an eternal cycle of hunger and feeding. Better than the prison you've made for yourself on this island. The silence that followed was different from the oppressive silence of previous nights. This was the silence of contemplation, of a consciousness older than living memory, considering a possibility it had never imagined before. Then Thomas Hartley appeared, not just his face in a photograph, but fully present, standing between me and the pale shape. He looked exactly as he had in the photo from 1923, young and determined. But his eyes were ancient, carrying the weight of a century spent trapped between states of being. You can do it, Hartley said, his voice barely a whisper. I can feel it considering, questioning itself for the first time. The binding I created is failing, yes, but not because I'm fading. Because the entity itself is changing, evolving beyond what it was. The fear that created it is being diluted by everything else it's absorbed. All those keepers' memories, their hopes, their humanity. What do I need to do? I asked. Nothing, Hartley said, and he smiled. The first genuine expression of joy I'd seen from him. You've already done it. You chose not to fear, not to run. You stood here and offered it a choice instead of accepting that it was unchangeable. That's all it took. That's all I needed. He turned to the pale shape, and I saw something incredible happen. The entity was changing, its form shifting, those wrong proportions slowly correcting themselves. It was becoming more human, or perhaps less monstrous. I couldn't tell which. I'm ready to go now, Hartley said softly. Ready to rest. The binding doesn't need me anymore because it's not a binding anymore. It's a choice, freely made. The pale shape spoke, but this time its voice was different, still inhuman, but no longer threatening. I choose to remain, it said. Not because I'm trapped, but because this is where I belong. The island is my home, and the silence is my nature. But I will no longer hunt, no longer feed on fear. I will simply exist. What about the keepers? I asked. The keeper program? No more keepers, Hartley said firmly. No more sacrifices. Seal the impossible room. Board up the lighthouse if you must. Let it stand as a monument to what we learned here. That even things born from darkness can choose to change. The photographs began to fall from the walls then, not violently but gently, like autumn leaves drifting to the ground. And as they fell, the faces in them changed. The terror faded, replaced by peace. Release. The consciousness of every keeper who'd been absorbed by the entity over the years finally set free. Thomas Hartley faded as the last photograph fell, his expression serene, grateful. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for finishing what I started." Then he was gone, truly and finally gone, and I was alone in the impossible room with an entity that was no longer quite so monstrous. "Will you keep your word?" I asked it. "Will you stay here and harm no one?" "I will," it said, and I believed it. This island is enough. The silence is enough. I need nothing more. I left the impossible room and closed the door behind me. By the time I descended the spiral stairs, dawn was breaking over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The beacon above continued its eternal rotation, warning ships away from dangerous rocks. But the silence that settled over Beacon Point as I packed my things was different now. Not oppressive or threatening, just silence. The natural quiet of an island in the middle of the ocean. When Morrison arrived exactly 3 weeks later, his face showed profound shock to find me waiting on the dock, sunburned and exhausted, but very much alive and whole. "You lasted," he said, disbelief clear in every word. "You actually lasted the full 3 weeks. The entities changed," I told him as I climbed into his boat. "Hartley's free, and you need to shut this place down. No more keepers, no more victims. It's over." Morrison didn't believe me at first, of course. That night, he brought a team back to the lighthouse to investigate. They found the impossible room, but it was empty, just bare stone walls with circles of old salt on the floor and hundreds of photographs scattered across the ground, all showing peaceful faces instead of terror. The pale shape was nowhere to be seen, though if you stood very quietly in that room and listened to the silence, you could almost feel something watching. Not threatening, not hungry, just aware. Just existing. The lighthouse was officially decommissioned 2 months later. After much debate, they decided not to demolish it, but to seal it up completely. The impossible room was closed off, the door painted over until it disappeared into the stone. Warning signs were posted. The island was declared off limits. And slowly, Harwich Point began to heal. The guilty knowledge that had haunted the town for a century could finally be acknowledged and then released. Some of the older residents spoke openly for the first time about what they'd known, about the keepers who'd disappeared over the years. There were memorials, apologies to families, and an attempt to make peace with a horrible history. As for me, I went back to the mainland and discovered something surprising. I could rebuild. The experience at Beacon Point hadn't broken me. It had given me purpose, strength, and understanding that even the darkest things could change if offered the right choice. I started a new business, this time with partners I trusted and lessons learned from past failures. I reached out to Jennifer, not to get back together, but to make peace, to apologize properly, to close that chapter with respect instead of bitterness. I called my mother and actually talked to her about what I'd been through, about what I'd learned. And I learned to appreciate silence again. Not the oppressive, threatening silence of Beacon Point at its worst, but the natural quiet of a world at rest. The space between sounds where all things become possible. Sometimes, late at night when the world is very quiet, I think about Thomas Hartley, about a young man who walked up those stairs knowing he might never come down, willing to sacrifice everything to save his town. And I think about all the keepers who came after, feeding a monster until someone finally offered it something no one had thought to offer before, a choice. The thing about belief is that it's powerful, but it's also flexible. We choose what we give power to. We choose what we feed with our attention, our fear, our faith. And sometimes, if we're very brave or very desperate, we can choose to change the narrative entirely, to offer even the darkest things a chance to become something else. Thank you for staying with me through Marcus's journey. I hope it gave you something to think about in these quiet hours. That fear is real, yes, but so is the possibility of transformation. That even things born from darkness can choose to change. That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is offer understanding instead of violence, choice instead of compulsion. If you enjoyed this tale from the Pale Watcher, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with others who appreciate a good scare, and maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. We have many more stories waiting for you, tales that will haunt you, challenge you, maybe even change you. Remember, silence is only empty if you choose to believe it is. What you fill it with, fear or possibility, horror or hope, well, that choice is yours to make. Sleep well, friends, or don't. The choice, as always, is yours. And if you find yourself on a lonely island someday, if you hear a creak on the stairs at 3:47 a.m., remember Marcus's story. Remember that even the most terrifying things can sometimes be reasoned with, understood, even transformed. The Pale Watcher will return soon with more tales from the edge of darkness. Until then, thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. And thank you for choosing to spend these dark hours with me.